It is a peculiar ache, the kind that settles quietly in the chest and lingers there for years when a child chooses absence over your presence. My son, Michael, had not spoken to me in over 2 decades. Not a call on my birthday, not a card at Christmas, not even the awkward kind of note people send when they feel obligated, but detached. He had simply disappeared from my life, leaving behind an echo of his voice that seemed to fade a little more with every passing year. I remember the last time we spoke, as though it happened only yesterday. We stood in the driveway of the house where he had grown up, the late summer air heavy with tension neither of us cared to disguise. Michael was angry, furious really, because I had refused to pay off a large debt he had taken on. It was not that I lacked the means entirely, but rather that I believed some lessons could only be learned through hardship. He saw it differently. He called me a failure of a father, his words cutting with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike. I told him that responsibility was something he could not borrow. His face hardened, he turned without another word, and then there was only the fading sound of his car pulling away. The years that followed became a quiet sort of existence. I retired from the post office, sold the family home, and bought a small cabin on the edge of a lake where the mornings were cool and the evenings slow. Fishing lines and well-worn novels replaced the chaos of working life, and I learned to make peace with solitude, even if it was not the life I had once envisioned. Then, one winter morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, the paper inside even thicker, the kind that carried the weight of importance before the contents were even read. It came from a law firm whose name I did not recognize. When I unfolded the letter, my eyes scanned the words twice, perhaps 3 times, before I allowed myself to believe them. A small logistics company I had invested in decades earlier, one I had all but forgotten, had been bought out by a major international shipping conglomerate. My modest investment had multiplied many times over. By the time the legal process had run its course, my quiet retirement savings had transformed into a sum I could not have imagined possessing. It was an odd feeling, this sudden shift from modest comfort to considerable wealth, made odder still by the fact that I had no one. I felt the urge to tell. At least I thought I had no one. Because on a cold December morning, as frost traced patterns across my window, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was one I had not heard in 20 years, yet recognized instantly. "Dad, it's me, Michael." He spoke warmly, too warmly, in the way a person might when they have already decided what they want from you. He told me it had been far too long, that Christmas was coming, and that he wanted me to come to his home for the holiday. He said we could catch up, as though 2 decades of silence could be bridged over dinner and small talk. I listened, but even as he spoke, I knew. Somehow, Michael had learned about the money, and I could not shake the feeling that this invitation had nothing to do with reconciliation, and everything to do with what he thought I could give him. The days leading up to Christmas in my part of the country are always slow and grey, the lake a muted sheet of steel under the weight of a winter sky. It is the season for quiet reflection, for the kind of stillness that invites you to take stock of your life. Yet, after that phone call from Michael, my mind would not settle. His voice, soft and overly warm, echoed in the corners of my thoughts, like a tune I couldn't quite forget. He had sounded pleased to hear me, almost relieved, though I could not believe it was the relief of a son missing his father. It felt more like the calculated warmth of someone trying to thaw the ice just enough to step inside. When I pressed him on how he'd been, he kept his answers light, little mentions of work, of the family, as he put it, as though I should know who he meant. Then, after only a few polite exchanges, he steered the conversation toward Christmas. "I'd really like for you to come this year," he said, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of insistence. "It would mean a lot to the kids to see you." The words were meant to tug at me, and in a way they did. I had grandchildren I'd never met. The thought of them knowing me only as a name, if that, was not an easy one to sit with. But the suspicion sat heavier. I knew Michael well enough to recognize when he wanted something, and the sudden warmth after 2 decades of silence was not easily explained by nostalgia. I told him I would think about it, and after a long pause that told me he had expected me to agree on the spot, he said, "All right, let me know soon. We're making plans." His voice caught slightly, as though the words "making plans" carried more meaning than they were supposed to reveal. When the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the grain of the wood under my hands. It had been years since Michael's voice had filled my home, and yet instead of comfort, it had left a residue of unease. I thought of the letter from the law firm, the improbable windfall it had brought me, and how careful I had been to keep it private. Only a handful of people in the world knew. The firm, my accountant, and one old friend from my days at the post office, a man I trusted like a brother. None of them had any reason to tell Michael. So how had he found out? Over the next few days, I replayed our conversation more times than I cared to admit. The pauses, the careful way he avoided certain questions, the fact that he had chosen this Christmas, of all the ones that had passed unremarked, to extend an olive branch. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that going might be exactly what I needed. Not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to see the truth for myself. If Michael was reaching out with genuine intent, I could forgive the past enough to stand in his home again. But if he was reaching out with his eyes fixed firmly on my bank account, then perhaps it was time for me to remind him that I had not survived 68 years on this earth without learning how to protect what mattered. I began making plans of my own. I had almost forgotten the stretch of highway that led out toward the part of the state where Michael now lived. The last time I had driven it, the trees were greener, the roads narrower, and my son was still someone I believed I knew. Now the forest that framed the 2-lane asphalt had grown taller, its branches interlacing overhead in places, casting long shadows even in the pale winter daylight. I left the cabin just after dawn, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I loaded my overnight bag into the truck. The lake behind the house lay frozen in silence, the kind of stillness that always made me pause before a long trip. I stood for a moment, hands deep in my coat pockets, wondering if I was about to make a mistake. But the decision was already made. Curiosity and suspicion are powerful motivators, and I had both in abundance. The drive was a quiet one. I rarely turned on the radio anymore. It seemed the chatter only dulled my thoughts, and today I wanted them sharp. I replayed pieces of my conversation with Michael, measuring each word in the cold light of hindsight. His invitation had sounded generous, but it had arrived on the heels of news he shouldn't have known. That was no coincidence. By midday, the city skyline came into view, glass and steel jutting up from the horizon like the spines of some colossal creature. Michael lived in one of those newer suburbs where every house looked like it had been drawn from the same set of plans: fresh paint, identical driveways, and trimmed hedges that never seemed to grow out of place. I had looked up his address before setting out and studied the route until I could picture it without a map. I wanted to arrive without the crutch of a GPS telling me where to turn. As I rolled into the neighborhood, I noticed something that struck me: how still it was. Even with Christmas a week away, there was none of the bustle I remembered from my own younger days, when children would be outside, darting between houses, and neighbors would stop each other in driveways for a quick word. Here the streets were empty, and the air had that faint scent of new construction, as if the place hadn't quite been lived in long enough to gather its own stories. Michael's house was near the end of a cul-de-sac, larger than I expected, its stone facade and two-story windows catching the weak sunlight. A late-model SUV sat in the driveway, polished to the kind of shine you only see in dealerships. I pulled in slowly, watching the curtains shift in one of the upstairs windows. Someone had seen me. When I stepped out of the truck, the front door opened, and there he was. Michael, older of course, but still bearing the same sharp jawline and dark hair that had once made people say we looked alike. Time had softened his edges, but there was something in his eyes, an alertness, a calculation that told me 20 years had not made him any easier to read. "Dad," he said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You made it." I took his hand, feeling the firm grip that was just a shade too deliberate, and stepped into the house. The warmth inside was immediate, scented with cinnamon and the faint tang of pine from the tall Christmas tree in the corner. Family photographs lined the hallway, though I noticed quickly there were no pictures of me among them. For the first time in 2 decades, I was standing in my son's home. And though he greeted me like a guest of honor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a play where everyone knew their lines but me. From the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the house had been prepared for me, though not in the way one might for a beloved father returning home after decades. Everything looked arranged, staged almost, as if I were a visitor from some important committee whose opinion would be recorded and later reviewed. The scent of cinnamon in the air was just strong enough to be noticeable without being overpowering. The tree's lights were perfectly spaced, and the table in the dining room was already set with more cutlery than a simple lunch could possibly require. Michael led me down the hallway with the kind of cheer that felt slightly forced, pointing out the guest room on the way. It was spotless, the bed made tightly, a folded towel and a fresh bar of soap placed on the dresser like a hotel welcome. On the nightstand sat a small picture frame, not of family or memories, but of a scenic landscape, something generic, impersonal. For a moment, I wondered if that small absence was deliberate. His wife, Ellen, appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was warm in her greeting, though in the way someone might be when their spouse has explained exactly how they should behave toward a guest. Her smile was pleasant, but her eyes seemed to measure me in the space of a heartbeat. We shook hands, exchanged polite words, and she disappeared back toward the kitchen with a glance at Michael. I almost didn't catch. We sat in the living room, the three of us, making conversation that barely scratched the surface of anything real. Michael asked about the lake, the fishing, the cabin, questions that felt like they had been pulled from a list of safe topics. I answered, careful not to offer more than was necessary. It was a strange dance, each of us speaking as though the past 20 years could be quietly set aside if we just avoided stepping on any sensitive ground. But beneath it all, I could sense an undercurrent, a rhythm that didn't match the words being spoken. Michael would occasionally glance toward Ellen, as if checking to see if it was time to shift the conversation. She, in turn, seemed to listen more than she spoke, her attention sharp and focused. At one point, Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and asked if I'd been keeping in touch with any old friends from the post office. I told him about a few, careful not to mention the one person who knew about the windfall. His smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker in his expression that told me he had been fishing for something, and I had not taken the bait. Dinner was served early, a carefully presented meal that looked like it had been taken from the pages of a holiday magazine. Roasted vegetables arranged in neat arcs, a glazed ham at the center, and a dessert already cooling on the counter. It was generous, yes, but also theatrical, as if they were trying to show me what a perfect life they had built. Throughout the meal, Michael kept circling the conversation back to family, to the importance of staying connected, to how Christmas is about coming together. He said it with the practiced ease of a man trying to lay the foundation for a request he hadn't yet made. I listened, smiled when appropriate, and stored every detail away in the quiet corners of my mind. Because whatever this performance was leading to, I intended to be ready for the moment the curtain lifted. It happened halfway through dessert. A moment so quick it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been watching closely. Ellen had just set a slice of pecan pie in front of me when Michael, mid-sentence, mentioned something about making sure the inheritance paperwork was handled the right way. He caught himself almost immediately, his fork hovering just above his plate, and tried to disguise it with a sip of coffee. It was a small thing, but it landed heavily. The word inheritance doesn't belong in casual dinner conversation between a father and son who haven't spoken in 20 years, especially not before the dishes from the first meal together are even cleared. I let the moment pass without comment, though I saw Ellen's eyes dart toward him, a silent reprimand passing between them. She busied herself with the dessert plates, moving from one place setting to the next, with the kind of energy people use when they want to fill the air with harmless noise. Michael, to his credit, tried to redirect the conversation. He asked about my cabin, about the upkeep, about whether it might be too much for me to manage on my own. His voice carried the same tone I'd heard in the phone call, a little too warm, a little too practiced. "I get by just fine," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's quiet out there, peaceful. I'm in no hurry to change it." He smiled at that, though there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, calculation perhaps, or the disappointment of a man whose first line of approach hadn't landed the way he hoped. After dessert, we moved back to the living room. The children, my grandchildren, though we were strangers to one another, came downstairs, introduced shyly by Ellen. They were polite, well-mannered, and careful in the way children often are when they've been told to be nice to someone they don't know. I tried to engage them, asking about school, hobbies, and favorite books. They answered in short bursts, eyes flicking toward their parents as if to make sure they were saying the right thing. As the evening wore on, I noticed Michael becoming more comfortable, his guard lowering bit by bit. The conversation began to drift toward stories from my younger days, and he asked questions that felt more probing than nostalgic, about investments I might have made, about people I still kept in touch with, about whether I'd ever thought about what comes next, now that I was, as he put it, in the later chapter of life. That phrase, later chapter of life, hung in the air like a draft from an open door. It was polite on the surface, but I knew what he meant. He wasn't just talking about age, he was talking about opportunity. When the night wound down and I retired to the guest room, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The first slip had come, and it had confirmed what I already suspected. This invitation wasn't about reconciliation, it was about positioning. And if that was the game we were playing, then it was time I began planning my next move. The house was still when I woke the next morning, the kind of stillness that makes you instinctively lower your footsteps. Pale winter light crept through the blinds, painting narrow bars across the guest room wall. I dressed without haste, listening for the sounds of life elsewhere, footsteps in the hallway, voices drifting from the kitchen, but heard nothing but the faint hum of the heating system. When I stepped into the corridor, I noticed details I had missed the night before. The framed photographs were all recent, no more than a few years old, yet none showed the children at ages younger than 10. There were no baby pictures, no evidence of the years I had missed. It was as if the time before this house, before this life they had constructed, had been quietly edited out. I found Ellen in the kitchen, already dressed, her hair pinned neatly back. She greeted me with a smile that was polite, but noticeably cooler than the one she had worn the night before. Coffee was brewing, its aroma mingling with the faint scent of toast. On the counter sat a half-finished grocery list, and I couldn't help but notice certain items circled: expensive wine, imported cheese, things you might serve when trying to impress someone rather than for everyday living. "Michael's out running a quick errand," she said, glancing at the clock, as if she too was keeping track of the time. "He should be back soon. We thought we'd all go into town later, maybe have lunch." I nodded, accepting a cup of coffee, and let the conversation drift to safe subjects. Yet as she spoke, her eyes occasionally slid toward the kitchen doorway, as though expecting him to walk through at any moment. It wasn't fear in her gaze exactly, but something close to anticipation, like she knew there was a plan unfolding and wanted to be ready for her part in it. When Michael returned, his mood was lighter than I had seen it yet. He carried a bakery box under his arm and launched into a description of the pastries inside, insisting we all try one. It was a charming gesture, but it felt rehearsed, another performance for my benefit. The trip into town was much the same. He pointed out local landmarks, spoke warmly to shopkeepers, and steered us past every boutique and cafe that suggested a certain lifestyle. I watched him closely, noting how often his hand drifted to my shoulder when he spoke, how he made a point of including me in every conversation, small touches designed to create the appearance of closeness. But there were moments when the performance faltered. In a small antique shop, I caught him glancing at the price tag of a mahogany desk, then at me, the calculation in his eyes as plain as daylight. Later, over lunch, he asked casually if I still handled my own finances, or if someone helped me keep track of all that. The words were delivered lightly, but his gaze held steady on mine, waiting for any sign of weakness. I gave him nothing but a smile. By the time we returned to the house, I knew two things for certain. Michael had a plan, and it revolved around my money. What he didn't know, what he couldn't yet see, was that I had a plan of my own. That evening, after dinner had been cleared away and the children were upstairs, I found myself alone in the living room. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light flickering across the walls, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe with each movement of the flames. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the street in a thin white layer. It was the kind of night that could have been perfect, had the years between us not been so sharply divided. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small wooden box. It was the sort of keepsake you might expect to find in a family home, polished, discreet, and not immediately remarkable. Yet when I picked it up, I felt the faintest trace of familiarity. I had carved one just like it decades ago, a weekend project I had made for Michael when he was a boy. His had been meant for his baseball cards. I had sanded the edges smooth so they wouldn't catch on the paper. I opened it slowly, expecting it to be empty. Inside, however, was a single photograph, faded, slightly curled at the edges. It was of Michael at 14, standing in our old backyard with his arm around his mother. I was behind the camera that day. I remember it clearly because it was the summer before everything began to unravel. That photograph pulled me back to a time when my son's trust in me was still intact. I remembered the arguments that came later, The way he began testing boundaries as he got older, the friends who led him into trouble. The first time he asked for money, it was for something small, a school trip, he said. The second time, it was to replace a stereo he claimed had been stolen. By the time he was 20, the requests had turned into demands, and the amounts had grown large enough to make me uneasy. The debt that ended it all came one humid August night. He had called me from a payphone, his voice urgent, telling me he was in trouble and needed help. I asked questions, he gave vague answers. When I pressed for details, he admitted he owed several thousand to people I didn't want him owing anything to. I told him I would not pay, not because I didn't care, but because I knew it would only happen again if I did. That decision, however sound in principle, came at a cost I had underestimated. He told me I had chosen my money over him, and when I told him it wasn't about money, it was about teaching him to stand on his own, he hung up. That was the last conversation we had for 20 years. Holding that photograph now, I felt the weight of those years pressing down. I was not without fault. Pride has a way of building walls as solid as resentment does. But whatever my role in the fracture, I also knew this: I would not be manipulated back into his life under the guise of reconciliation, only to be stripped of what I had worked for. From the kitchen, I heard the murmur of voices, Michael and Ellen speaking in low tones. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught enough of the rhythm to know the subject was me. I placed the photograph back in the box, set it on the mantel exactly as I'd found it, and returned to my seat by the fire. The past was a long shadow, but I had learned something over the years. Shadows move with the light, and I was beginning to see how to turn it in my favor. The next morning brought with it a brittle cold, the kind that makes even a short walk to the mailbox feel like crossing an Arctic plain. I found Michael already in the kitchen, dressed neatly as though expecting company, though there was no one else due to arrive. He greeted me with the same bright politeness as before, yet I noticed his eyes lingering on me a fraction longer, as though searching for signs. Of what? I wasn't entirely sure yet, but I suspected it had to do with vulnerability. Over coffee, I decided it was time to learn just how much he knew. The trick, I reminded myself, was to make it seem as though I was speaking without agenda, letting details slip in the way an old man might when he'd had enough of winter's confinement. "I've been thinking," I began, stirring sugar into my cup. "It might be nice to take a trip this spring, maybe somewhere warm. I suppose I could even rent a place for a few months, though I'd need to get a few things in order first." Michael nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Sounds like a good idea. You've earned it. It's just a matter of what to do with the cabin while I'm away." I continued, keeping my tone deliberately casual. I wouldn't want it sitting empty, but I wouldn't rent it to just anyone. His eyes sharpened at that. "Well, you know," he said, trying to keep it light, "family's always an option. Ellen and I could look after it. Make sure it's in good shape." There it was, the first nibble at the bait. I smiled, as though the thought had never occurred to me, and let the moment pass without giving him an answer. Instead, I shifted the subject to fishing, recounting a story about the largest bass I'd ever pulled from the lake. He laughed at the right places, but I could see his mind was elsewhere. Later, as we drove into town for groceries, I set the second test. Passing a bank, I remarked, "Strange how they've changed everything over the years. Used to be you walked in and spoke to someone. Now it's all online. Makes it easier to keep track of things from anywhere in the world." Michael gave a short laugh. "Convenient, though, means you can handle well anything, even while traveling." He glanced at me, the corner of his mouth twitching, as if he had more to say, but thought better of it. At the store, I noticed him paying close attention to what I bought, almost as if he were calculating the cost. It was subtle, the kind of observation most people wouldn't notice, but I had spent my career reading people, first in the post office, then in a small stint as a union rep, where listening between the lines was half the job. Michael was gathering information, piece by piece. By the time we returned to the house, I was certain of two things. He suspected the scope of my resources was greater than I had let on, and he was trying in small ways to confirm it without tipping his hand. What he didn't realize was that in trying to read me, he was revealing himself, and the more I learned, the more I began to see the shape of the counterplay forming in my mind. It was late afternoon when I caught the first undeniable crack in Michael's carefully maintained facade. The house was quiet. Ellen had taken the children to a neighbor's holiday gathering, and Michael had said he would stay behind to finish a few things in his study. I had been sitting in the living room, leafing through a book I wasn't really reading, when I heard the low murmur of his voice drifting down the hallway. At first, I assumed he was on a personal call and paid it no mind. But the tone, measured, deliberate, with pauses that sounded like he was choosing each word with care, pulled at my attention. I set the book aside and rose, moving quietly toward the sound. His study door was nearly closed, just a sliver of light spilling into the dim hall. I stopped short of the threshold, not out of fear of being caught, but to ensure I could hear clearly without giving myself away. "Yes, I'm telling you, it's just a matter of time," Michael was saying. "Once he sees how close the family is, how much we could benefit from a little help, he'll want to do something for us. And if we're smart about it, it won't be just a one-time thing." There was a pause, the muffled sound of a voice on the other end, too faint for me to make out the words. Michael chuckled softly. "Look, I know he's not stupid. I'm not going to push. But people his age, they start thinking about, well, you know, legacy. And if we're already in the picture when he makes those decisions," the rest was lost as he turned slightly away from the desk phone, his voice dropping even lower. I stood there for a long moment, my pulse steady, my expression unreadable even to myself. It wasn't that I hadn't suspected this was his aim. It was that hearing it spoken aloud, stripped of all pretense, confirmed the depth of his calculation. He wasn't just hoping for a gift or a gesture. He was laying the groundwork to secure a portion of what I had earned, not through honest conversation, but through a campaign of staged warmth and controlled proximity. I stepped back, returning to the living room before the call ended, taking my seat as though I had never left it. When Michael emerged a few minutes later, he was all smiles, speaking lightly about dinner plans and how the snow was picking up outside. I matched his tone, my own smile practiced and calm, even as my mind worked at a different pace entirely. If he believed he was playing a long game, then so be it. I had lived long enough to know that the longer a con is in motion, the more room there is for it to collapse under its own weight. And I intended to give him just enough rope to do exactly that. That night, while the others slept, I sat at the small desk in the guest room, the soft light of a single lamp casting a pale circle on the wood. I wasn't writing anything down, at least not yet. I was thinking, sorting through the pieces of the last few days, weighing each one the way a craftsman might examine the tools for a job that requires precision. Michael believed he was working from a position of control. He thought he had time on his side, that if he moved slowly and carefully enough, I wouldn't notice the net tightening around me. But I had no intention of waiting for him to close it. The first step in my plan was to give him what he wanted, at least the appearance of it. I decided I would start offering small pieces of personal information, things that sounded revealing, but were in fact meaningless or misleading. Casual mentions of meeting with an old contact about a possible investment, talk of streamlining my finances in preparation for travel, hints that I might be considering changes to my will. None of it would be true, but each suggestion would be crafted to encourage his sense of progress. In the morning, I put this into motion. Over breakfast, I mentioned that I had been speaking with my financial advisor before making the trip, just to tie up a few loose ends. Michael's eyes flicked toward Ellen in a quick, silent exchange before he nodded and asked careful follow-up questions. I answered with vague but enticing details, each one designed to make him believe he was edging closer to his goal. That afternoon, while we were out running errands, I paused in front of a travel agency window, studying the posters for tropical destinations. "It's been years since I've gone anywhere like that," I said lightly. "Maybe it's time I enjoyed myself a bit before I'm too old to." Michael chuckled, but there was a spark behind his eyes that betrayed a different kind of interest. By the time we returned to the house, I could already see subtle changes in his demeanor. He was warmer, more attentive, and less guarded, as though my hints had reassured him that his approach was working. That was precisely what I wanted, because the more he believed he was in control, the easier it would be to guide him exactly where I needed him to go. What Michael didn't know, and couldn't yet guess, was that the trip he was so carefully steering me toward wasn't the journey I intended to take. I wasn't heading into his plan, I was building the map for mine. By the third day of my visit, the pieces of my counterplan were fitting together with the precision of a puzzle I had worked on for years rather than hours. Michael's behavior confirmed that my small, misleading disclosures were having the desired effect. He had begun treating me like a man who was drifting toward a decision, one that would benefit him greatly, without quite realizing how closely I was watching his every move. That morning, while Ellen was upstairs with the children, Michael suggested we take a drive, just the two of us. He chose the scenic route out of the neighborhood, as though the open road might make the conversation flow more naturally. But I knew he had something on his mind. He started with light talk, memories of old neighbors, places we used to visit, before easing toward his real point. "You know, Dad," he said, keeping his eyes on the road, "I've been thinking a lot about family lately. About making sure we all look out for each other." I let him talk, nodding at the right moments, giving him nothing to push against. When we stopped at a small diner for coffee, I steered the conversation just enough to plant my next seed. "It's funny," I said, as though the thought had only just occurred to me. "When you get older, you start thinking about where everything will go. The house, the cabin, the savings. It's not something you can take with you." His eyes lit just enough for me to see the flash, before he covered it with a careful nod. "That's true. I mean, you want to make sure it goes to the right people you trust." I agreed, but kept my tone measured, almost distracted. Trust is important. Sometimes the people you think you can trust turn out to be the ones you have to watch most closely. That line hung in the air like the faint scent of smoke after a candle's been blown out. Michael didn't flinch, but I noticed the way he tightened his grip on his coffee cup. Back at the house, I made a show of stepping outside for a phone call. In reality, I called an old friend from the post office, someone who owed me a favor. I asked him to set up a meeting with a lawyer he trusted, one who could help me draft a temporary arrangement that would look very different from what it actually was. The plan was simple. I would let Michael believe I was ready to make him part of my financial decisions, even let him see paperwork that seemed to confirm it. But the reality would be that he was walking directly into a legal structure designed to keep him out entirely, while giving me every opportunity to watch how far he was willing to go when he thought the prize was within reach. I ended the day as I had the others, smiling over dinner, laughing at stories, and letting Michael think the threads of influence he'd been weaving were holding fast. He had no idea they were unraveling in my hands. 2 days later, the stage was set for the next act. I had spoken to Harold Bennett, a retired colleague from my post office years, who now spent his time between fishing trips and doing quiet favors for people who'd earned his trust. Harold had a friend, Margaret Klein, a sharp, methodical attorney with just enough theatrical sense to understand what I was trying to pull off. Margaret agreed to meet me under the guise of being my estate advisor. I told her the broad strokes of my situation, careful not to embellish. The truth in its simplest form was already compelling enough. She laughed when I explained the part she'd be playing and said she'd be happy to oblige. I arranged for her to drop by the house in the mid-afternoon, a time when Ellen would be home and the children still at school. That morning, over breakfast, I made sure to be seen flipping through a small folder of bank statements, old ones, the kind that looked official but were long outdated. I kept the numbers facing me, but the weight of the pages and the glint of the embossed letterheads were enough to catch Michael's attention. When Margaret arrived, I greeted her warmly at the door, ushering her into the living room with the kind of familiarity that suggested long-standing trust. Michael, curious by nature and now piqued by the presence of a stranger, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "This is Margaret," I said easily. "She's been helping me get a few things in order, wills, property documents, all that fun stuff you tend to put off until you're my age." Margaret smiled, her handshake firm but warm. "Your father's been very thorough," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of admiration. "It's refreshing to see someone so organized about their future." We sat together at the dining table, where I spread out a few folders. Margaret and I spoke in low, deliberate tones, with just enough occasional volume to make sure fragments of the conversation drifted toward Michael, who lingered in the doorway, pretending to scroll through his phone. Words like beneficiaries, asset allocation, and family provisions floated into the air. Every so often, I would nod solemnly, or jot something down, or lean in to clarify a point. Once I even asked Margaret, "Do you think it makes sense to prioritize family over other arrangements?" She replied with a carefully ambiguous, "That depends on the circumstances." By the time she left, shaking Michael's hand at the door, I could see the shift in his expression. The seed had taken root. He believed he had moved closer to the center of my decisions, closer to the prize he'd been chasing since the day he called me after 20 years of silence. That night, as I sat in the guest room with the door closed, I allowed myself the smallest of smiles. The paperwork Margaret had shown him wasn't a will, it was a simple mock-up of property trusts with every meaningful section left blank. But Michael didn't know that. And the beauty of a good performance is that it doesn't matter whether the props are real, only that they look convincing from the audience's seat. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of crisp, silent snowfall that seems almost scripted. The house smelled of roasting turkey and pine, the tree glowing steadily in the corner. Michael and Ellen moved through the kitchen like seasoned hosts, plating side dishes and topping off wine glasses, their conversation light but edged with the quick glances of people keeping track of something unspoken. We gathered around the dining table, a spread so elaborate it could have graced the cover of a holiday magazine. The children laughed at small jokes and passed rolls from one end to the other, their voices carrying an innocence that had long since drained from the adults in the room. At first the talk was harmless, gifts, the weather, stories about the neighbors, but before the plates had been cleared, Michael steered the conversation onto a more deliberate path. "You know, Dad," he began, his fork resting neatly beside his plate, "Ellen and I were just talking about how important it is to plan for the future, especially with family, makes things easier for everyone." Ellen nodded, smiling warmly in a way that almost masked the way her eyes searched mine. "It's true, we've seen too many people leave things unsettled. It can tear families apart." I let their words hang in the air a moment before answering, swirling the wine in my glass. "Planning is important," I agreed, "but so is making sure the plan serves the right purpose." Michael leaned in just slightly, as though inviting a private exchange despite the full table. "And you've always said family comes first." It was a careful move, too careful. The room felt quieter, though no one had stopped speaking. Even the children seemed to sense a shift in tone. "I said slowly, "but I've also learned that being family doesn't always mean having the same priorities. Sometimes it just means you share a last name." Ellen looked down at her plate. Michael smiled faintly, but it was tight, like a thread pulled too far. "Sure," he said, "but in the end you want to leave something behind for those who will appreciate it." The statement was dressed as a sentiment, but the ask beneath it was clear. I met his gaze for a long beat, letting him think I was weighing the moment. Then I offered a mild smile and shifted the conversation back to the children, asking about their favorite holiday traditions. For the rest of the evening, I played my part as though nothing significant had passed between us. But I knew, and so did he, that a line had been crossed. He had moved from suggestion to pressure, and that meant the time for subtle maneuvering was almost over. By midnight, when the house had quieted and the snow outside lay thick and undisturbed, I knew the next day would bring the final act. Christmas morning came draped in quiet, the kind of stillness that makes even the smallest sounds feel amplified. The smell of fresh coffee drew me to the kitchen, where Ellen was already setting out pastries and fruit. Michael arrived a few minutes later, his expression bright but with that glint I'd learned to recognize, anticipation thinly disguised as holiday cheer. We exchanged gifts in the living room, the children tearing into wrapping paper with the delighted chaos only youth can manage. I had brought each of them something thoughtful, books, puzzles, small treasures that spoke to their personalities rather than their price tags. For Michael and Ellen, I handed over a long, flat envelope, the kind that suggests something weighty and official. Michael's hands lingered on the flap before opening it, his smile tightening in expectation. Inside was a neatly typed letter on crisp stationery. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines, saw the initial spark of triumph flicker, before confusion crept in to replace it. The letter was a formal announcement. I had established a charitable trust in my name, one that would support rural community programs, veterans assistance groups, and educational scholarships. The trust was irrevocable, the assets already transferred, and the board, composed entirely of old colleagues and trusted friends, would administer it independently of me. At the bottom, in my handwriting, I had added, "Legacy isn't about leaving something behind for those who expect it. It's about giving to those who need it." Michael looked up, his jaw working as though he were trying to find the right words but couldn't quite shape them. Ellen glanced at the paper over his shoulder, her face tightening just slightly before smoothing into something polite. "Wow, Dad. That's generous," Michael said finally, though the warmth in his tone had cooled several degrees. "I thought so," I replied, my own smile calm and steady. It felt right to put things in motion while I'm still here to see the good it can do. For the rest of the morning, The mood remained cordial but subdued. The children still played with their gifts, the snow still fell outside, but the invisible current that had hummed through the visit had shifted entirely. Michael had no angle left to work. The door he'd been inching toward for days had closed, quietly but firmly, and I had locked it from the other side. When the time came to leave, I thanked them for their hospitality, hugged the children, and shook Michael's hand with the same polite firmness I'd given strangers over the years. In his eyes, I saw not anger exactly, but the dawning understanding that the performance had been two-sided all along. Driving away, I felt no malice, only a deep, steady satisfaction. I had not just protected what was mine, I had reminded myself, and perhaps him, that trust once broken is not something you can stage your way back into. And as the snow-laden road opened ahead of me, I realized this was the best gift I could have given myself this Christmas, the certainty that I was the one writing the ending. 3 weeks had passed since I had driven away from Michael's house that snowy Christmas morning. The winter had deepened in my small lakeside town, the ice stretching further across the water each day, the sound of it creaking in the night like some old ship settling into harbor. Life had settled back into its quiet rhythm, mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons tending to the woodpile, evenings with a book, or the radio humming softly in the background. Every so often I would hear from Ellen, brief, polite messages asking after my health or sending photographs of the children at school events. Michael rarely spoke directly. When he did, his words were clipped but careful, as though he was still adjusting to a reality in which my trust fund wasn't his unspoken inheritance. I didn't resent the distance. In fact, it felt cleaner than the forced warmth of our December days. The charitable trust had already begun its work. I received reports from Margaret about grants approved for a veterans outreach program and a scholarship for a promising young mechanic from a nearby town. Reading those updates, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a sense of impact unclouded by suspicion or strings attached. My legacy was already out in the world, moving in directions I could feel proud of. One particularly cold morning, as I locked up the cabin before heading into town, I found myself thinking about that first phone call Michael had made after 20 years of silence. At the time, it had felt like an opening, a bridge being rebuilt. Now I saw it differently, not as a return to the past, but as the final step in closing a chapter that had lingered open too long. Some stories don't end with reconciliation, some end with understanding, and understanding, I've found, can be its own kind of peace. That night, I sat by the fire, the trust paperwork tucked neatly away in the desk, the snow falling steadily outside. The world beyond my window was quiet, unhurried, and for the first time in years so was I.